We've been now in this for over 14 months, and so we want to look at the collective mental health impact of COVID-19 and look at ways to build resilience through a developmental, strengths-based, trauma-informed approach. And that includes some specific tools and interventions to promote coping for youth and families. And really just want to highlight that we are really trying to embed a lot of well-being approaches in all of our meetings. And that includes starting all of our meetings with some kind of check-in and really checking in with ourselves and checking in with our colleagues and also family members. And so we've been using check-ins like this that really, also help promote some laughter and enjoyment and fun. But really wanting to highlight the importance of checking in with our feelings. And this can be more of a kind of personal weather report. Are you feeling really sunny or partly cloudy or feeling more gloomy? And I really appreciate these alpacas. Personally, today I'm feeling like number 8. It feels like spring is here and I'm feeling hopeful about the future. This slide comes from Trauma Transformed, which is a 7-county Bay Area initiative that was started in 2015 and is hosted by East Bay Agency for Children. It was started by Dr. Ken Epstein. And really just wanting to highlight this series of statements was put out right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I just want to read through these with you. We acknowledge that we are in the midst of unprecedented times. We acknowledge that we are each holding a multitude of feelings, responsibilities, fear, and joys at the same time. We acknowledge that there are many responses to stress and uncertainty, each of them valid. We acknowledge that there is no better opportunity to practice compassion and collective care than right now. This is the work. We acknowledge the critical need for reflection, inquiry, and prioritization of the most critical needs. This has been a really challenging year in many ways. Not only have we had the significant impact of coronavirus, and then specific to children and families, the impact of distance learning, but also the multiple wildfires that have affected the West Coast and California in particular. California has had the worst 4 wildfires in the past 10 years in a lot of the wildfire history. And we've also had really significant impact of longstanding structural and systemic racism, and the impact of that has been widely felt. And this has affected multiple racial and ethnic groups. And we just want to acknowledge that while we have been in the same storm, we each have different boats, and that this depends in part on your resources, on the color of your skin. No judgment in this, we're all in this together, but we are able to uncover with our curtain pulled back that we have all of these different disparities in different ways, and want to really call out racism, poverty, xenophobia, anti-immigrant policies, and want to be really mindful of what's called performative activism in this. But there has been a significant opportunity to raise awareness and to help try and promote leveling the playing field a little bit more. The collective trauma of COVID-19 may simultaneously be calling out some of these inequalities, but there is a disproportionate effect on persons of color. We want to be mindful of that. We also want to acknowledge that we have been often stuck at home and often with lots of time on our screens, sometimes late at night, and really wanting to look into the crystal ball of the future and figure out what will happen. There's been a lot of uncertainty. And we know that significant exposure to media around difficult events, things like the Ebola virus and also repeated media exposure to events around 9/11 have resulted in vicarious traumatization. And this can really impact sleep and cause longer term post-traumatic stress symptoms. So wanting to be really mindful of that. And what are the ways that COVID-19 has impacted us? It's really wreaked havoc on our routines and schedules and our connection to community and loved ones, and many other circumstances that are unique to each individual and family. And it's also become really clear that there are many, many gaps in our system with disproportionate effects on minorities and women, in particular, what's happening with childcare and also mental health care and economic and educational and social opportunities and disparities. This is from February 2021 life evaluation. This is a Gallup poll. And as you can see, there have been some of the lowest valuations of who's felt like they're really thriving with an all-time low at the beginning of the pandemic at 46%. And there's been a significant 10-point decline, which represents close to 25 million people. And this does approximate the number of people who have filed for unemployment before the end of April as a result of the economic collapse. And there's been a higher than ever amount of stress and worry amongst adults ages 18 to 44. This is more than older age groups or younger age groups. The National Center for Health Statistics partnered with the US Census Bureau and has been doing weekly household pulse surveys that include assessment of depression and anxiety done through standard screens. One is the generalized anxiety screener, and another is the PHQ-2, which is a screener for depression, and has found that there's been significant increases in rates of depression and anxiety since the pandemic started. This has been pretty consistent. So last year, between August and October, the rates of depression were 31%, anxiety 39%, and for both 44%. In contrast, during January to June of 2019, the rates of anxiety were around 8%, depression about 6.5%, and for both about 11%. And then this has remained fairly consistent through 2021. So February through March of this year, rates of combined anxiety and depression have been around 30%. What has this meant for individuals? So for those of you who are parents, you have stepped into the role of not only being parent and also whatever professional role you fill, but every day being superheroes in those ways, and then needing to step into the role of additional caregiving for children, also maybe worrying about the generation ahead. So grandparents who may be completely out of touch and very alone and not able to care for themselves, also stepping into the role of teacher and coach and tutor and increased household duties that have all resulted in significant amounts of stress and with often very little break in between. Wanting to highlight the impact in particular on women. So historically, women have tended to serve as the emotional buffer for children between the stress of the outside world and what's happening in the home. And we know that on average, 10% of working mothers between April and August of 2020 reported not working each week because they were providing care to a child who was not in school or childcare. And labor force participation overall was reduced by about 3% among married mothers with a child under the age of 6, 4% with children ages 6 to 12, and about 3% with children ages 13 to 17. We also know that that currently 70% of parents with children report that their child care provider is either closed or has significant reduced hours. And there are anticipated childcare deserts, in particular in socioeconomically lower neighborhoods. And that has resulted in a really significant disproportionate effect on working mothers in more low-income jobs. So what does all this stress mean? We know from studies around toxic stress that there are certain levels of stress that we need to have each day. It's what kind of motivates us to get out of bed and start our day. And a lot of this can be seen as kind of positive stress. So an example could be when children go to school for their first day of school or spend a day with a new caretaker. Tolerable stress is when there's a stronger amount of stress that gets activated. And this may happen during a natural disaster that's usually time limited, or following the death of a close friend or family member. And then there's something called toxic stress, where there's a heightened response to more frequent and prolonged adversity. We've been in this for quite some time. And again, thinking about uh, differential impacts on communities of color in particular, and those who have less economic advantage. And that may result in increased toxic stress response. So what happens to our bodies during a stress response? We've all heard of the fight, flight, freeze response. This is actually something that our bodies do automatically when we experience threat. And it's a very primitive brain function that has been there for a really long time. So thinking about potentially cave person times, there is a lion that just came out and is about to attack you. You have a couple of options. One is to prepare to fight, or prepare to run away, or to freeze and play dead, so to speak. And our bodies process the signal for fear almost immediately, even before we can actually articulate what's happening. And I just want to highlight that this is all something that happens very automatically. So here in the prefrontal cortex of your brain, this is where you have your kind of higher order processing. You're able to process complex tasks. But when you are faced with a significant threat, then your amygdala here takes over. And that sends a flood of norepinephrine that kind of hijacks your thinking brain and causes this cascade of hormones that really send signals to your body to prepare to fight or to run away. So if you've ever felt very anxious, you notice that your heart goes faster, you may feel short of breath, your muscles get tense, you may feel dizzy. These are all signs that your body is taking in more oxygen, your blood is pumping faster because you're getting ready to fight or run away. And this all happens very automatically. And then there are secondary responses that result in increased cortisol, and that can affect the way that your body processes fats and sugars. And that can happen over a prolonged period of time in the face of constant or chronic threat or stress. So more simply, here, your sympathetic nervous system is that fight, flight, freeze, activated or gas pedal part of your nervous system. And then your parasympathetic is the brakes. This is what helps you slow down. So the way to activate your parasympathetic nervous system is to actually allow yourself to breathe a sigh of relief. When you exhale, that is signaling that it's okay to not take in so much air and get ready to run away, but rather that you can now calm down, you can relax, the danger has passed. And so this is the science of why exercise, or part of why exercise is so good for you, is that it actually helps to release all of that adrenaline and trigger the parasympathetic or rest response. And just wanting to point out here that when we have overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, or the gas pedal response, then you can get kind of stuck in this on mode, and you have symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of insomnia. You might feel kind of easier to startle. And meanwhile, your body is trying to compensate by trying to press that brake pedal. And sometimes when it's trying to compensate, then you can get stuck in this off mode after a prolonged period of stress. And so this is where you start to get more shut down. You may feel more numb, you may feel more tired, and just not able to experience much of any emotion. And this is when the parasympathetic nervous system gets overactivated in response to prolonged stress and prolonged sympathetic activation. So I wanted to invite you right now to actually try and activate your parasympathetic nervous system response. We don't have control over our heartbeat, and we have some control over how tense our muscles get. But one of the most effective and simple ways to actually activate that brake pedal is to control our breathing. And the way that we can do that is actually having our out breath, our exhale, be longer than our in breath. So right now, I'd like to invite you to just take a deep breath. And because we're in the Bay Area, we can do this in a way that's called 415 breathing, which is the area code for San Francisco. And so if you can sit in a centered way and take a deep breath in, 2, 3, 4, pause, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, and in, 2, 3, 4, pause, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, and in, 2, 3, 4, pause, out, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you can just notice how your body feels, and that hopefully you are feeling more calm, more relaxed. And for those of you watching right now, I just want to ask you to take a moment and think about, where are you on the stress continuum? Are you in the range of that positive stress that's helpful and motivating? Is it tolerable? You are feeling stressed but able to still get by? Or does it feel overwhelming? What are you noticing about your own trauma exposure response? For people who have experienced past traumas, sometimes a new trauma can feel additionally triggering or activating or additionally stressful. For some people who have experienced some difficulty and found ways to manage, they may find that it's actually built some resilience and ability to get through more stressful moments because of learning coping skills and learning that they actually can manage. For you, what has been the greatest challenge or challenges of this past year? Just inviting you to reflect and think about that for yourself. Wanted to highlight here some of the things that have been, I think, discussed in past presentations as part of this series, but thinking about how our thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations are all connected. And so the idea that there's this, what's called a cognitive triad, meaning your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all kind of linked and impact one another. And then more recently, there's been adding in, what are your bodily sensations? So as an example, if you have a thought, I should read more about COVID-19 so I can be more prepared, and the feeling that I'm not doing enough, I'm not prepared enough, that may cause some anxiety or fear. And so then that results in a behavior of staying up later and reading more and not getting enough sleep, which can then result in maybe consuming more caffeine the next day, feeling like you're feeling more anxious, and may cause some tense muscles and racing heart and feeling tired, but also overstimulated. And all of these things can go around and affect one another in an ongoing cycle. In terms of what we have control over in this, we often don't have control over our feelings, but we can affect some of these other things to help manage our feelings. So for example, thinking about your bodily sensations, you can manage things like hunger and how much sleep you get, how tired you are, how your body feels, how you're sitting in the chair, how you're breathing. You can manage your behaviors. You can choose to not read more, particularly late at night, or reduce screen time exposure at that time, and many other behaviors. We also have control over our thoughts. A lot of us are vulnerable, though, to what are called cognitive distortions, which are actually meant to be protective. They're meant to help us manage in the face of what seems like a threat. That said, they can also create anxiety and create a sense of depression at times. So these are some common cognitive distortions that you can read more about in this article that's referenced here. But in particular here, you can see some should statements. I should read more about COVID-19 so I can be prepared. And and those kinds of things, if you recognize that it's actually more anxiety talking and producing those cognitive distortions, and then what is the reality? Do you really need to read more, or is that just a should statement? So how is all of this stress for those of us who are parents and or family members um, of younger children, how is that affecting kids? They certainly do feel our stress and respond accordingly. And have you ever noticed how anxiety or other big emotions can be really contagious? Um, so parents may be more stressed right now, not only for financial reasons, but because of feeling constrained in some way, not having adequate childcare, not feeling very prepared to be an effective teacher or tutor or coach. And so feeling stressed, feeling helpless, feeling overwhelmed, then inevitably does impact those around us, and in particular our children. And so this is just really highlighting the need to, as the saying goes, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before putting it on your child, because if you don't do that, then you may end up causing kind of more big emotions in your children and not being able to take care of them or any others effectively. So thinking about parenting self-care as having these key aspects. One is really being aware of how you're feeling. And that really does require slowing down and focusing inwardly to determine how you're feeling. And I just want to highlight that this doesn't need to take a long time, just like in the breathing exercise that we just did, that just took about a minute. And really, so promoting that self awareness, what's going on in your body, what types of thoughts are going through your mind, and how those are affecting your behaviors and actions. And then trying to find some balance. I've really observed some esteemed colleagues who are, intentionally saying no to things that they might otherwise say yes to during these difficult times because they are needing to juggle so much more. And then really highlighting the importance of connection. This year has been isolating for many, and we have found lots of amazing workarounds, like being able to do this educational session through Zoom, and being able to do a lot of video chatting and connection in these ways. But it is really key to have connected and supportive relationships that really help to promote wellness. Here, I just want to highlight kind of more of the impact overall. This is from the first few weeks of the pandemic and quarantine in Shanxi, China last year, and looking at the tremendous impact of quarantine in terms of anxiety symptoms. So thinking about clinginess in particular in young children, inattention, irritability, worry, difficulty sleeping, and wanting to highlight that what we know from other similar situations is that in those persons who have been quarantined, there is significantly greater impact when there's not clear communication about why and how long, and kind of knowing what to expect. We also have seen increased rates of substance use across the board as well. Here, just wanting to highlight that, I really appreciate how much mental health has been discussed in the media, and this is not a new problem. So pre-pandemic, 1 in 5 children in the US have had a diagnosable mental health disorder. This is according to the CDC in 2018. And we know that a significant percentage of mental illness onsets by a very young age, and that suicide has become the second leading cause of death in persons ages 10 to 24 and also 10 to 34. Post-pandemic, we've seen a few different important and noteworthy things, and we are all seeing kind of increased rates of referral for mental health providers, both therapists and psychiatrists, and looking at kind of what are the numbers. So the data are still somewhat scarce because there hasn't been enough time to do a lot of high quality studies. But this study right here was done in 1,000 parents of children in Toronto, Canada, with youth aged 2 to 18, and found that across 6 domains of mental health, that actually 70% of kids ages 6 to 18 and 66% of kids ages 2 to 5 fared worse in at least one of these domains, the most common one being actually inattention, followed by anxiety and depression. But I think it's also important to note that a fair number of kids, in particular preschool age kids, actually fared better in at least one of these domains. And we want to talk about what have been some of the hidden benefits and hidden blessings. I also want to underscore that one of the most significant things that have been explored are the impact of loneliness. So we know that there's been a significant increase in loneliness, in particular in adolescents, and that the duration of the loneliness is a stronger predictor of depression rather than the intensity of the loneliness. So what have been some of the hidden benefits? I've had a lot of teenagers in particular appreciate the benefits of having more sleep. They don't need to get up at 6:30 in the morning to make it to their 8:30 or 9 a.m. class. They can actually sleep often until 8:55 and then wake up and attend school. There's been greater independence, which has been really helpful for some, but not all kids. That includes the ability to self-pace. They've experienced kind of lower academic demand. We know that kids who end up feeling overscheduled, overstressed, that they have a lot of vulnerability to anxiety and depression. There's been a lot less social pressure, in particular, what are you wearing, or, having to deal with all of the, what a lot of teenagers affectionately call drama with peers. And there's also been kind of increased recognition about the importance of addressing mental health issues, and with that, decreasing the stigma around addressing mental health. Some of the challenges have obviously been significant isolation, and then a significant impact on social development and being able to meet normal social milestones. There's been a lot of grief around missed rituals, missed graduations, missed rites of passage in different ways, not getting to go to prom or homecoming, and then a lot of feelings of uncertainty. And we need to think about kind of specific populations. So some shy kids with social anxiety are doing much better, but they are also out of practice. And so now that some kids are actually starting to go back to in-person school, there's a more significant struggle to manage that anxiety and feel confident again in facing their peers. Some kids with ADHD who are very hyperactive, they're no longer getting into trouble as much for being the class clown, but they are really significantly struggling with inattention and getting schoolwork done and being able to stay on top of things. Some really creative kids or kids who thrive well on less structure, and kids who are part of marginalized groups like LGBTQ, and those who are subject to bullying have been doing better and may actually find ways to continue in doing more virtual school. But there have also been significant challenges, in particular, children with learning challenges. And there's also been increased concern for eating disorders and body image concerns, and concerns for increased abuse without adults around to supervise and observe and also report concerns for abuse. We know that in general, there's been a kind of mixed bag, but that on the whole, that kids do seem to be struggling a little bit more. And we want to be mindful of how kids are going to be going back to in-person school, and that may result in more challenges as kids have been out of practice with socializing with their peers. This is just a summary of teens and young adults who across several different college campuses. And these were some really common symptoms that they described. So lack of motivation, anxiety, stress, isolation. And we know that kids who were non-Hispanic white, who had higher social class and spent at least 2 hours outside or less than 8 hours on electronic screens, were more likely to experience lower psychological impact. So how do we re-regulate? We want to first create safety through reestablishing rhythms and routines. And we also want to make sure that we're honing those connections through relationship, and then really focusing on a sense of purpose. A lot of people have felt like Their sense of purpose has been very much disrupted. We have had completely changed our schedules, and a lot of people have talked about kind of brain fog, not really being aware of the passage of time, that the weekends have felt like the weekdays, and that even, usual milestones like the school year ending and that really signaling the beginning of summer, those usual milestones have been missing. And we need to really ensure that we're paying extra attention to creating routines and rhythms. And then similarly with really promoting relationship and connection and doing things intentionally. We also want to think about things from a strengths-based approach. It can be really easy to end up becoming critical or feeling like a certain behavior means that someone is a bad kid or a bad person, and really wanting to shift that to maybe that's just a problematic behavior, but that in general, you are a good kid, and that things can shift from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you, and then to what is right with you. And coming at this from a strengths-based approach really helps shift not only the experience of maybe the child in this instance, but also helps to shift the thinking of the adult or teacher or whomever is working with the child to really focus on what are the things that are going well, what are the things that you're doing right. And it's amazing what a difference that can make in terms of orientation and ultimately feelings and behaviors. Wanting to look at that, creating safety through finding rhythms. We know that across time, that most cultures have always had a way of creating rhythms, creating music that is across the board. And part of the reason for that, according to Bruce Perry, who studies trauma and trauma treatment, his theory is that we actually become used to those rhythms very early when we're actually in the mother's womb, that we hear the mother's heartbeat, that we feel the rocking and the swaying, and that becomes very soothing for us. And when we don't have those rhythms and routines, it becomes very destabilizing and stressful. Also, being able to create a schedule, in particular one that's visibly posted, then it can be a lot easier to say, okay, so-and-so is in charge of dinner tonight. And it's harder to argue with a piece of paper than it is to argue with an individual. So if you co-create a schedule together, then you have that kind of shared commitment, that shared accountability, and you can easily see it. You know that this is what's happening next. That sense of predictability is very important. This slide is actually from the Surgeon General's report, the Roadmap for Resilience, looking at managing toxic stress. And these are the key components according to this roadmap, that we want to make sure that we have these key components. We've talked about a lot of these already. Supportive relationships, good quality sleep, balanced nutrition, ensuring good physical activity, ensuring mindfulness. And this doesn't need to be, for long stretches during the day, but just being able to be mindful in the moment, being self-aware and aware of what's happening in the present moment. And access to nature. We know that time spent in nature can be very healing, and ideally also access to mental health care. I wanted to kind of go through some normal milestones for different age ranges for kids. So younger children, these are all kind of normal milestones that that young children go through. And we know that for especially young kids, they may have increased fear of being alone, having more bad dreams. They may have some regression in their behaviors, including speech or changes in their bowel and bladder management, more bedwetting perhaps. There may be more temper tantrums or whining or clinging behaviors. And so ways to manage this can be encouraging expression through play, through reenactment, through storytelling, and having calming, comforting activities right before bedtime. Really, really, really making sure that you have family routines and structures and rhythms in place, and avoiding media exposure. Kids this age may not be able to distinguish reality from something that's made up, and they may really just experience the emotion of what they see on the screen. And then because they're more apt to have kind of magical thinking around things, they may distort what the messaging is from media. For grade school age children, so these are kind of normal milestones and things to think about as kids grow older. Some of these may have been disrupted a little bit because of not being able to socialize as frequently, and just wanting to keep in mind that it's normal to have maybe more whining, more aggression in this age group, more clinginess intermittently, also having nightmares, sleep or appetite disturbances, having physical symptoms. I have a headache, I have a stomach ache, I don't feel well, maybe feeling more withdrawn from peers or having some decreased interest. And so how can we respond to this? Really wanting to ensure that there's reassurance that you're able to connect with your children, and trying to find ways to stay in touch, whether that's through video chatting with friends or being able to do games, and really ensuring as much as possible regular exercise, stretching, being able to engage in educational activities together, and really encouraging expression, both through play and also through talking. Here are some tips that I really appreciate. Some of these phrases are from Dan Siegel, who's a child psychiatrist who really practices mindfulness-based, attachment-based psychotherapy. And so some key things are naming it to tame it. That's why all of these faces are here. It's like if we can name our emotions, then we can much more easily tame them and decrease the power that they have over us. Some families like to have a feelings chart that they actually go through and check in at the start of each day. And that way you're creating the language and the ability to name emotions and getting comfortable with doing that before it gets to be kind of a high stakes, high stress situation, because we know then our thinking brain shuts down and we're not able to access the names of those feelings, and it may be much harder to do. So starting that with a daily ritual of naming your feelings can really help to promote that safety through the ritual and also increase understanding about different feelings. Connect and then redirect is really key. The simplest way to put this is when I'm trying to talk with my kids and they may be feeling, some kind of big emotion, then I really ask them to look at me with their listening eyes, because making eye contact really ensures that kind of more emotional, deeper connection. And then you can try to direct them away from it rather than just blindly yelling or reacting or responding. But it's really important to make sure that you try to understand what's going on and connecting first. Move it or lose it just means we need to move our bodies. We need to be able to regain some balance, and that sometimes actually trying to address something cognitively, verbally in the moment with your child is just not going to work, because they are just in that kind of more amygdala response, fight, flight, and are not able to engage effectively in talking about it. And so being able to move your body, kind of release some of that energy and tension, and then being able to talk about it later can be really helpful. This is just a kind of reminder around, behaviorism, and in particular for younger children, it's really important to think about the situation or moment if you're having a challenging behavior, what may be inadvertently reinforcing, and so what's the behavior that is problematic, what happened right before that, and then what happened right after that. And one of the easiest examples is if, every time a child goes to the grocery store, they get a piece of candy, then of course that's going to become very reinforcing. And so maybe if they go to the grocery store and they're especially hungry, that can be a contributing kind of antecedent that is causing them to ask for that even more. And then if one day they end up not getting the candy, of course, there's going to be a big reaction. So making sure that they're fed and that you tell them in advance, we're not going to get candy today, we're going to stop with the candy, may improve the likelihood of a better outcome. That said, you may still get a really big response on the very first day when they're not going to get the candy. But if you change it to, we can give you the candy when we get home, if you can manage really well in the store, then that would be a reinforcing consequence that actually helps to shape the behavior that you want. So thinking about, again, having, really clear expectations for your younger child, and then again, focusing on what you can do, what you can control, rather than the things that you can't do. Really encouraging younger children to be able to engage in developmentally appropriate chores, because that helps to build confidence, that helps to build the idea that I can actually do this and contribute to the community that is your home. And then for adolescents, so these are some normal milestones. And it does seem that adolescents are having, significant impact from schools being closed and, being more in the home with their family members, when actually what's expected of them at this age is to start to make more friends and test out their identity outside the home, and be able to get a lot of input from their peers. And that often kind of parents, they may be there to support their teen, and the teen may really want to be with them one moment and then really not want to the next moment. And so the reason that they're spending a lot of time in their room on their screens is because they're actually trying to connect with peers and wanting to have, less time with parents. So, and again, thinking about the impact of that isolation that they are currently or have been experiencing throughout this pandemic. So here, wanting to underscore that having really clear expectations that are reasonable and realistic, and ideally kind of co-created. If you have the expectation, okay, I need you to take out the trash and make sure that you set the table for dinner, and then I expect you to join us for dinner, and I expect your homework to be done by X time, you're naming that in advance. You're setting those clear expectations. But having expectation, that's not predictable, that's not clear, can be really challenging for teens, especially right now. It's also really important to be as honest as you can be, and to be explicit about this. I also just want to underscore that adolescent risk taking is really normal. And so some of the, at least what we were seeing kind of earlier on, really like teens violating, quarantine or not wearing masks or things like that. Some of that is really part of this adolescent kind of developmental step of wanting to take risks, wanting to test out, can I get away with these things? And that a lot of that is quite normal. And so wanting to focus on, what is really a very significant risk and curtailing that, but just knowing that some of that is very developmentally expected. Also wanting to just keep in mind that there are a number of possible additional derailers that teens face, or that children face, that may be adding to struggling a little bit more. So, for example, any kind of learning differences, long-term stress and trauma. People who have experienced a lot of trauma may find the isolation even that much more challenging, or if people have difficulty regulating their emotions, or having attentional and impulse control problems, we're definitely seeing kind of across the board greater difficulty with focusing and paying attention. Here, I just want to underscore that what you see on the surface often is just the surface. And So some things that, for example, look like anger may actually be because of that activation of that fight or flight response, feeling, for example, here stressed or anxious or disappointed. And so this phrase is really helpful, I find, and I've borrowed it from a colleague with permission. Be curious before you get furious. So asking why, asking what happened, how are you feeling, what was going on before reacting. Here, wanting to underscore the importance of connection, in particular, the benefits of family dinners. Anne Fischel is a psychologist and family therapist and is the co-founder of the Family Dinner Project, which is a nonprofit initiative that encourages families to connect over meal times. And there are a number of benefits of families eating together, in particular, cognitive ones. So young kids have bigger vocabularies if their families eat dinner together consistently. Older kids tend to be doing better in school. There are physical benefits, better cardiovascular health, lower rates of obesity, and also psychological impact. This is associated with lower rates of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance use, and also fewer behavioral problems in school. The purpose of this is aimed at, in particular, teens, because these are some basic life skills that is important for every teen to learn before they launch, before they leave the home, and so really being able to to know how to use a credit card, for example, how to be able to cook certain key things, being able to manage a simple budget. These are things that there may be even greater opportunity to practice while we do have kind of more family together time. And this really helps to not only build skills, but to be able to inspire that confidence that, yes, I can manage on my own. And then in terms of finding purpose, it is important for families to schedule activities and do things together that do have a sense of purpose. And not just everyone kind of being in the room together, but everyone's on their own screens or devices. You want to create activities like family dinners that have a combined sense of purpose. So being able to build upon each of these things. This is from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I just think it's a useful way to remember different components that help to build resilience overall. So the more connections that we have, the better we tend to do. And the more skills that we have, the more confident we can be. Being able to work on character. So children are always closely observing, really at any age. And children with strong core values who make the greatest contributions and have the best sense of self, and also have the most secure and healthy relationships. Being able to contribute to others, doing for others, can really give a really significant sense of purpose and also feeling better about yourself. And then thinking about coping, what are the ways that we are demonstrating coping skills for our children and teaching them to manage their own feelings. It's okay to have any kind of feelings. It's what you do with them. And then how do you focus on what you can manage or can control? So we've talked about a lot of these, but I think a couple that I really want to highlight here are being able to build hope for oneself. Number 5, and this is important for us as parents to do, to think about what it is that you want rather than worrying about what it is that you fear. And really, number 9, practicing self-care and self-compassion, paying attention to that. We know that that people who can practice not only self-care, but also self-compassion end up having healthier relationships with their family members, with their partners, with their kids, as well as with colleagues and others outside the family unit. Here is a snippet from something called the collaborative problem solving principle that is something that was designed by Russ Green and Steve Ablon, and wanting to think this is linked to using a strengths-based approach, and that it follows the principle we're all doing the best that we can. And when we're not doing that well, it's because of a lack of skill rather than a lack of will. And so it may be that, that a teen doesn't know how to, for example, do their homework really well. And so it's not just that they're avoiding doing it, it's just that they're having a hard time focusing or that they don't understand it. And that if they could do better, they would do it more easily. And so thinking about what are the skills that are lacking, and then what are the ways that you can help to support them being able to do the plan that's going to work best for them. Also wanting to highlight that it's important not to do top-down adult imposed kinds of plans, especially with teens, because that often backfires. Ideally, you want to co-create a goal together and then co-create how to get there. And then plan C is if there's really just not enough skill right now to be able to move forward with that, with the original plan or the goal. And so you just drop the expectation. This has been true for certainly some academic work that has just felt way too hard to manage all the different media platforms that are required. And so just having kind of lower expectations. Sleep is a big one. And so just wanted to touch on this. There has been a really significant impact on sleep that has been challenging. And so here is kind of a reminder of, what does sleep look like across the lifespan? How much sleep do each of us need? And, for really young children, obviously they need a lot of sleep. And then teenagers still may need up to 8 to 10 hours. Oftentimes they're not getting that, and that they may be wanting to stay up later and then sleep in later. And so with that, when do you turn off the screens, and then how much screen time is too much? I think everyone has recognized the need for being on screens in order to do virtual school and to complete assignments. And there's still a recommendation to limit the number of hours of non-academic screen time, ideally. That said, there does seem to be kind of a benefit to some amount of social media and being able to manage and maintain social relationships, and that it does result in kind of more feelings of inclusion and feeling more confident as part of their social media relationships. And I think, as with most things, there's a balance here. So, there's a greater proportion of teenagers who say that social media helps them strengthen friendships and that they feel more positively about it. But there are a fair number of teens who report more negative feelings here. So how much is too much? It does seem like moderate screen use is associated with greater sense of well-being and more connection, but that excessive screen time users report overall less lifetime satisfaction. And there may be some impact of kind of excessive use on both delaying bedtime and limiting time spent outside in nature and or in physical activity, and also in connected relationships. So here are some recommendations: being able to establish healthy sleep practices, setting aside regular bedtimes, and again, really trying to adhere to that schedule as much as possible with predictable routines, and wanting to avoid screen use in the hour before bedtime because it can impact your body's natural melatonin production. And then wanting to make sure that the screens stay out of bedrooms as much as possible. And then avoiding just having the TV on in the background. We talked about this a little bit, but there is kind of increasing support for more time spent in nature. And there are some limited studies that show that, being able to disconnect completely from our screens, our phones for even just a few days have significant impact on attention and well-being. And that being able to just be out in nature has a beneficial effect in terms of mood. This is a recent paper that was just published by Dr. Tom Boyce, looking at kind of the long-term effectiveness. I think we want to take the long view of what the impact has been. I am getting a lot of parents asking, will this permanently scar my child? Will my child be damaged forever because of the experience of this past year or however long this ends up lasting? And I think the short answer to that, based on what we know from other studies, is that most of us will recover, most of us will do well. I think that we've learned that we are very adaptable and that we generally are resilient in the face of stress, and that there can be kind of longer term impacts for those who may be genetically a little bit more vulnerable and or who have greater levels of toxic stress in their environments, and then what happens over time. And we know that the single biggest modifiable factor in here is having supportive, loving relationships with at least one adult caregiver, but ideally many connected and loving, supported individuals over time. We do need to believe that these days will pass, but also keeping in mind that we are not quite there yet. And to underscore the importance of relationships and having caring adults, wanted to highlight that during World War II, there were many children in what was called Operation Pied Piper, who were actually transported away from their parents, away from the bombings in London in order to keep them more safe. They were transported out into the English countryside, and actually children who stayed with their parents amidst the bombings, but were with their loving, supportive caregivers, actually fared better from a longer term mental health standpoint than those who were taken away. I do want to highlight the incredible opportunities that we have here. Again, thinking about the reduced stigma around mental health issues and wanting us to think collectively about expanded access to mental health care. And that includes digital platforms, that includes more school-based care, and looking at also ways to support behavioral health integration in primary care, and looking at consultative models of care that provide briefer interventions than long-term traditional mental health care models. And then the creation of accessible toolkits. There are a number of resources that are out there that have been made available through the pandemic. And I think if we can just take little bits at a time from each of these toolkits and do what works for us, that will be incredibly helpful. Again, wanting to remind ourselves that that we do need to care for ourselves, and that it's about self-preservation, and that we want to think about meaning making. That includes being able to talk about what's going on, talk about the pros, the cons, the struggles, the hopes that we have realized during this time, and not just going quickly to forgetting or thinking that, well, back to school is going to mean back to normal, because it may or may not mean that. I think that we need to look at what has been the collective impact, how are we learning from this experience, and being able to remember the impact that it has had, for better and for worse. So some key takeaways that I'd like for you to come away with, that mental health disorders are incredibly common, and that includes pre-COVID, that right now we can see that some kids are doing worse, and that some are doing better. There aren't any easy answers, and that we've also learned that we are resilient, or we're reminded again that we're very resilient, and we can be hopeful and cautiously optimistic. We need to find ways to foster and promote more resilience, and that we need to be mindful of what things look like when children do go back to school, and also looking at additional models for mental health care delivery. And I will pause on this and pause for questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much there were so many gems just along the way in that whole talk. It makes me at the end, I'm just thinking to myself, boy, I really wish I could see like the whole set of slides and pick the various ones just to kind of remind myself of, because there's so much there. I really appreciate it. Um, I have a bunch of thoughts that come to my mind of things that we could chat about, and I want to bring up one question that's come through from the Q&A. This question is, so they're curious if anyone has studied single children and looked at their pandemic coping skills, having grown up with no siblings. It's interesting that the question goes on to say, assuming that gives them a sort of edge, do their skills come at a cost?
I think this is a great question, and I personally have not seen any studies related to the difference between single children and and siblings. But I will just share what I've observed clinically and also personally. And that is that, I mean, I think as with most things, it's been kind of a mixed bag. I have friends and colleagues who have single children, and they've really observed maybe more regression in terms of their levels of play and their coping skills, and then in terms of if I can speak with my own kids, they have certainly had an increased kind of closeness, and then also of course increased challenge and struggle at times. But there have been many moments where I've certainly appreciated that they've had each other to play with during this time. They're 7 and 9, and I think for better and for worse, it certainly has brought them a lot closer. But I think that we have yet to see what this looks like across the board.
Yeah. It's just thinking about how to take advantage of some of the perspectives and tools, the research-based tools that you presented. I wonder if we could just think of a couple of scenarios. There's so many different things that have come across for many of us as practitioners, and as you mentioned, for our friends and families. But let's just pick an example of, say, it's a family with a 13-year-old who is starting to retreat and withdrawal and stay in their room a little bit more and not showing up, and is in many kind of real life scenarios. Let's just say it's an overtaxed parent who's trying to balance work. Perhaps it's Zoom based, perhaps it's not, but their child is at home and they have to manage all of these things. So they're feeling stressed too. How would you, granted, it's hard in the general sense like this without the specifics of the situation, but what would you suggest for them to begin a process if they're starting to say, I'm a little worried?
I think I hope I'm hearing your question correctly. It sounds like both being able to kind of manage the structure of the day amidst the multiple demands, and then concern for possible emerging depression, or just kind of isolation.
Yeah, or perhaps actually just naming the behavior. Let's say that the parent says, my kid seems to be withdrawing. How do we go about guiding a parent in the process of how much of a problem is this?
I think looking at what's a change from baseline, and also are they still able to manage their minimum expectations. Usually the minimum is being able to kind of keep up with schoolwork, and acknowledging that there has been kind of less demand academically in general, and so, but looking at that, are they able to complete their basics, or are they really just not functioning well, and not functioning appropriately? And then are their usual kind of preferred activities, do those still seem fun to them or not, depending on what those are? I've had some young people say, even the video game that I loved for years is no longer enticing to me. I'm just not motivated to do anything. And or being able to connect with peers. if those kinds of things are happening, then that's definitely more concerning. And ways to try and connect can be to do some kind of shared activity, whether that's asking someone to asking your teen to make dinner with you, or just holding that as an expectation, but doing something where there's maybe an additional distraction, even just driving together where you don't actually have to look at one another, but be able to just kind of start the conversation in a really gentle way. What's going on?
A nice allusion to that tool of kind of doing something actively together that keeps the attention off of something else, perhaps. To keep playing the devil's advocate a little bit. Let's say the teenager just says, "I don't want it."
Sometimes,
No,
yeah, and that happens, very frequently, and especially thinking about those behaviorism principles. We're all creatures of habit, and the more we do something, the more we tend to do something. And so, if maybe I've been in my room mostly and saying I'm doing homework, but I'm actually chatting online or looking at YouTube or whatever, and I've been doing that for hours a day for weeks on end, then I'm going to be less motivated to change that behavior. But, being able to just offer what's called, some really limited, scaffolded, you know, ask like, hey, I just need to talk to you just for 5 minutes, or I need your help just for a couple of minutes. And then offering a forced choice. So, you can either help me now or you can help me at 2 p.m. But I really, I do need you to do this. And so if I, as the teen, feel like I have a little bit of control over that, then, that can really help. Sometimes the answer might still be, no, I don't want to do that at 2 p.m. And that's where, thinking about like, okay, what's the consequence going to be, if they're not able to do it.
if I'm hearing you there's a bit of parents managing their expectations. Is that there's not going to be a technique that's going to change your child's attitude or tone or behavior or mood in an evening intervention or a week's worth.
Right. And that's okay, that it doesn't
exactly.
it doesn't have to be, with a great attitude or, done perfectly, especially if you're out of practice with that. But that eventually over time, there may be some pushback. But if you as the parent hold the expectation, even if, I am not really wanting to do my homework or do it really well or help you chop vegetables, if I know that like over the long term, that's your expectation, then eventually I'm going to learn how to chop the carrots, like well enough to your liking.
How about another common scenario is younger kids, 3 to 8, or just to narrow it down, let's say between 5 and 8, who are starting to have difficulty with emotional regulation, where their regression is showing up as more angry outbursts, more a little bit of even testing with door slamming or throwing something in the room. And it's a surprise to parents, like that's not usual for you. What are some ways you might guide them in first or second steps as approaches?
One of the tools that I think is really so important is just basic validation, and that means not I know how you feel, because I can't ever know how someone else feels, but to be able to look at the situation and okay, I can tell that you're feeling angry right now, or I know that was really upsetting, but to be able to not give up, and if need be, to be able to give a few minutes of quiet and space, but then to still hold the expectation. Okay, I know you're angry. You may not want to talk to me right now, but in 5 minutes, I need to talk with you about what just happened. Or, you can tell them, I can tell that you're upset. Let me know when you're ready to talk about it. And usually within a few minutes, or sooner, they will want to reach out because at that age, they really are wanting to regulate. They do want to feel better. They just don't know how. It's a question of lack of skill, not will, usually. And then kind of bigger picture, setting things up in a way that helps to prevent that situation from happening. And that usually includes those, combinations of the structure and schedule, and then also the connection and sense of purpose.
Lovely, thanks. Yeah, there's an area of questions that I've asked a lot of our speakers in the last few weeks about distinguishing times when parents, when it's helpful for kids, let's say, for example, to use an earlier framing you had about positive stress, and then there were three in the toxic stress, and I can't remember how the characterization was in the middle.
Tolerable.
Pardon?
Tolerable.
Tolerable stress, right. So in that tolerable stress range, there can be parenting approaches that go different directions. And one would be the tough it out, grit, tenacity parent that is encouraging, you can do this, you can get through this, you're going to be fine. And then there's another strategy of empathic joining, this is difficult, that kind of understanding, joining with the struggle of this, but perhaps more of a like, yeah, I hear it, that's really tough, I'm really sorry. It's an area that I wonder a lot about how to help guide folks on when you as the parent become that stereotypical coach, it's more of a pressure. And when does that pressure shift people to more of a toxic experience? When does it shift into a positive experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, being able to have the best of both of those things. So, what I really appreciate about the kind of tough it up or tough it out, you can do this, is actually the communication. I believe in you. You are resilient. You can do this. You just need to learn the skills how. And what's maybe missing from that is the validation of, yes, this is hard, and I will teach you. So, and then the other extreme of that is maybe the overly validating and just focused on the feelings without actually holding out that hope. I believe in you, you can do this, and you are resilient. I will help you learn the skills, and I'll help you more at the beginning. And then as you get better, I will help you less. But it needs to be kind of up with those.
Couldn't have said it better. That was lovely. I like that distinction between the two. So for now, we don't have any other questions. I wonder, you had mentioned a couple of resources. I know you mentioned Dan Siegel, who has a number of books and even workbooks in the whole brain. Are there any particular resources you would recommend around supporting families other than the ones you've mentioned?
There are a few different kind of sources of resources out there. And so the collaborative problem solving approach is something that you can Google, and there are a number of videos that pop up if that's something that you'd like to learn more about. That really is aimed at both kids with maybe attentional or other learning problems who do have kind of a not so obvious lack of skill in being able to solve their problems. And I think it's also a useful approach, especially with teens who need to give some input into solving their problems. So that's one that I think is really helpful. And then, for younger kids, there are a number of resources on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that are really helpful, and ones that are specific to not only coping in COVID, but also wildfires. And they have some online books, that talk about how to talk about this with kids. Sesame Street has some really useful resources for younger children as well.
Oh, last question for you. What are your favorite children's books to either read to kids or for young teens to read for themselves that you're aware of that are not directly about this topic, but perhaps indirectly, if any?
Gosh. Yeah. I think That is, that's a tough one. I think that, where the wild things are is really helpful for our younger kids, just to know that, the monsters, represent different difficult feelings, right, that need to be managed and tamed. And so I think that's a great one for younger kids. And then I think, in terms of older kids, it really depends on where they're at and what their interests are. But
Ramona series.
I love Ramona. Ramona is a great problem solver. Yeah. I think that, books that really help to show some level of both struggle and resilience. And so Ramona is really, great with that. And yeah, so I'll pause there. But a lot of kids are wanting to, some fantasy and places where they can, find heroes.
Well, Dr. Steinbuchel, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your experience, your wisdom, your grasp of this topic, and sharing that with everybody today. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us for the last several weeks of this series. This is the end of this particular mini med school series. It's been a pleasure to present this to you all, and we wish you the best. It's so nice at this point to be able to grasp onto the hope of the vaccine and the real hope that in the next coming months things are going to get better and better. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.